Mending Wall by Robert Frost. Robert Frost, the renowned American poet, was born in the year 1874 and he left for his heavenly abode in the year 1963. He was one of the most admired, honored, and influential poets of the 20th century. He was highly regarded for his depictions of rural life and his command of American colloquial speech. His simple style of writing and constant attention to nature makes his poems unique. The love for nature reflected in his poems earned him the title American Wordsworth. His works frequently employed settings from New England in the 20th century, using them to examine complex social and philosophical themes. A popular and oft-quoted poet, Frost was honored frequently during his lifetime. He received 4 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry and was also named as Poet Laureate of Vermont. He dabbled with both farming and teaching, but was always convinced that his real calling was to be a poet. His first poem, My Butterfly, was published in the year 1894 in a New York literary journal, The Independent. He married Eleanor Miriam White, his high school classmate, who was the major inspiration for his poetry till she died in 1938. In 1912, the couple moved to England after they tried and failed at farming in New Hampshire. While in England, he was influenced by his contemporary poets like Edward Thomas, Rupert Brooke, and Robert Graves. He also established friendship with Ezra Pound, who helped to promote and publish his works. By the time he returned to the United States in 1915, he had published 2 full-length collections of poems, A Boy's Will and North of Boston, and his reputation was established. In 1920s, he was the most celebrated poet in America, and with each new book including New Hampshire, A Further Range, Steeplebush, In the Clearing, his fame and honors increased. His poems, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, The Road Not Taken, Birches, were the most anthologized poems in English literature. Our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was very fond of the last 4 lines of his very famous poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. The lines go like this. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. The poem Mending Wall is included in his second collection of poems titled North of Boston. It is said that his poems usually begins in delight but ends with wisdom. Are walls and fences instrumental in the retention and renewal of human relationships is a question central to Mending Wall. The main idea that the poet wants to convey is about man-made divisions. The wall conveys a symbolic meaning of separation. The separation works on various levels. It works especially in the name of nationality, religion, caste, and race. It can also operate on the lines of social, political, and economic considerations. Although keeping walls guarantee us safety and security, they are the main reasons for lack of understanding among people. It was published in 1914 as a first entry in Frost's second book of poems, North of Boston. The poem is set in rural New England where Frost lived at that time. The poem describes how the speaker and a neighbor meet to rebuild a stone wall between their properties, a ritual repeated every spring. This ritual raises some important questions over the course of the poem as the speaker considers the purpose of borders between people. The title of the poem, Mending Wall, is ambiguous as the word mending can be used as a verb and an adjective. When used as a verb, it signifies an act involving the speaker and the neighbor where they mend the wall. But when used as an adjective, mending implies a relationship that the speaker and his neighbor share, which they are trying to mend. The poem goes like this. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swill under it, and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The poet begins by saying that there is something mysterious in nature which brings down walls, that doesn't allow a wall to exist. The American winter, which is quite harsh and cold, brings in snow, frost, and ice. Hence, the damp and frozen earth under the compound wall gets swollen and it disturbs the shape of the wall, and stone boulders fall down, causing a gap big enough for two people to pass right across the wall. The poet has purposefully used the word spill. The word is used to refer to a delicate act, for example, spill the milk or oil, and is usually attributed to liquids. It is poet's technique to make us understand the lack of strength of a stone wall which might tumble down at the slightest disturbance. Groundswell also has a different meaning, that is, an increasing number of people raising an issue or supporting a cause. The work of hunters is another thing. I've come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. After the initial reference to nature being a cause for the disturbance of the wall, the poet says, hunters do destroy the shape of the wall. Hunters who ride fast on horseback leap over the walls, and when they leap, the boulders get disturbed. They spill the boulders and they fall on either side of the wall. Once the hunters have gone, the poet comes to have a look at the fallen boulders and try to place them back one by one. Then the rabbits hiding behind these fallen boulders become a prey to the yelping dogs. Here we can see how closely Frost observes nature. There is also a varied reading for poet's reference to hunters. Perhaps he had in mind mischievous children coming along with their dogs, chasing rabbits who were trying to hide behind the wall. The gaps, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. You neither see or hear anyone destroying the wall, letting gaps come in, or anyone making the wall. It is done so casually, as the poet later says, how they make the wall. However, these gaps are seen in every spring, a time preordained to mend the wall. When it is winter, these gaps can hardly be seen due to the heavy snowfall. But at the onset of the spring season, the snow would have melted, and we find that many of these walls have to be repaired. People usually wait for spring to take up any repairing work like mending the wall. The poet goes in search of his neighbor who stays beyond the hill to remind him that it is mending time. They meet on a particular day according to their convenience, walking on their respective sides, and try to repair the damage. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves, and some so nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. The poet talks of this effort he and his neighbor are taking of walking across the line of the compound wall and repairing it. Each one picks up the boulders from his side and puts them back on the wall, exchanging pleasantries. He humorously remarks that some kind of magic is essential to make the stone boulders balance on the wall, as the boulders come in different shapes like bread loaves and bowls. They chant words of magic and command these stones to stay balanced in proper positions, at least till their backs are turned. During the process of handling the stones, their hands become rough and worn out. To the poet, this task of mending the wall is nothing less than an outdoor game with each player on their respective sides. The coming together of the two neighbors could be linked to an ancient Roman festival, Terminalia, in the honor of god Terminus, who presided over boundaries. His statue was merely a stone or a post struck in the ground to distinguish between properties. His worship is said to have been instituted by Numa Pompilius, the legendary second king of Rome, who ordered that everyone should mark the boundaries of his landed property by stones to be consecrated to Jupiter Terminalis, and at which every year sacrifices were to be offered at the festival of the Terminalia. On the festival, the two owners of the adjacent property crowned the statue with garlands and raised a crude altar on which they offered up some corn, honeycombs, and wine and sacrificed a lamb. They concluded with singing praises of the god. There where it is, we do not need a wall. He is all pine and an apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the corns under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. The modernist in the poet thinks of the futility of such a wall and hence finds arguments to convince his neighbor. He tells him that neither the apple trees on his orchard nor the pine cone on his neighbor's side are going to encroach on each other's property. It could also mean that both of them might not have cut the branches of their trees and allow the branches to lean and fruits to grow on the other side of the wall. And if that's not an issue, why should they have a wall? The poet tries to make the neighbor understand that perhaps they do not need a wall. His neighbor, who is a man of few words, comes up with the dictum, good fences make good neighbors. Perhaps what he meant is one should learn to be within one's limits. By allowing these walls or fences to exist, they learn to respect each other's existence and life. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. The warmth, color, vibrance, and energy of the spring season brings out the child in the poet and makes him mischievous enough to drive in some ideas into his neighbor's head. He asks his neighbor, why does he think walls make them good neighbors? He wants a strong reason from him. When they do not have cows to encroach and graze on each other's property, why should they have a wall? Before I built a wall, I would ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. Now the poet comes out very strongly with his feelings. He says, if he were to build a wall, he want to know what are the things he was walling in or letting in, and what he was walling out or keeping away. It could mean peoples, attitudes, ideas, etc. From the physical representation of the wall, the poet takes it to the mental notion of a barrier in our mind. Barriers could mean not liking a person for his looks, his words, his color, clothes, and so on. Do we need such barriers? He wants to know whether his action of building a wall meant an offense to anyone, or not building a wall meant an offense. He again stresses his previous notion that there is something mysterious in nature that wants walls to be demolished. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly. And I would rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old Stone Age savage armed. The poet knows that his neighbor is not going to be convinced so easily. He wants to tell his neighbor that perhaps the invisible mischievous spirits in nature might be bringing down the wall. But this fanciful idea, too, is not good enough to convince him. Why do I have to keep finding reasons to convince him that a wall is not required? Why can't he say aloud his old-fashioned tradition-bound thoughts? Here, the poet might have stopped picking up the fallen boulders from his side. He sees his neighbor holding stones by the top in both hands like a Stone Age pagan caveman, as if they are his weapons. He goes about his job, not paying heed to anyone. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He'll not go behind his father saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says again, good fences make good neighbors. Looking at his neighbor, the poet feels that he is moving in darkness. The darkness is caused by his ignorance and not by the woods or shade of trees. The poet takes a distant, objective approach and starts critically commenting on the attitude of his neighbor and his ignorance. The poet realizes the futility of enlightening him. The neighbor vehemently refuses to budge from his traditional conservative thinking instilled in him by his forefathers that good fences make good neighbors. This idea is fixed in his head as hard as a stone, and he is unwilling to accept poet's modern approach about walls. The poem thus concludes with the adamant statement by the neighbor. Here we feel that the poet too has changed his mind and might be coming to a compromise. The poem seems to end with a mark of respect to his neighbor's idea. The poet realizes that for a peaceful coexistence with his neighbor, he may have to follow the ritual of mending the wall every spring. Give respect and take respect would be an ideal decision in such a situation. Symbolic significance of the wall. A significant feature of Froe's poem is its ability to produce diverse levels of meaning. Frost here presents a situation drawn from everyday life of a common man and looks at it from different angles represented by the poet with modern views and his neighbor with traditional views. Literally, the poem is about the process of mending a wall and two different attitudes towards it. But symbolically, the poem is about mending human relationships and the qualities needed to live harmoniously in society. In spite of their contrasting views, the poet and his neighbor are willing to work together and cooperate. The task of building the wall brings the neighbors together. The presence of the wall between them makes them realize each other's importance. The walls make the individuals indispensable from each other. There is a silent relationship between two persons, two groups, or two countries if there is a wall or border. Regardless of the enmity, it is the wall which makes them neighbors. The wall connects and separates simultaneously. Fence symbolizes national, racial, religious, political, and economic conflicts which separates man from man. Not only does it separate properties, but also stands as a barrier to friendship and communication. Another related theme is the incessant task in life. The activity of mending the wall as well as destruction does not end. They need to mend it every spring. The repairing of the wall and the repairing of the neighbors continues every spring. The purpose and the purposelessness, connection and separation, time and timelessness, place and poses are well realized in the action of mending. Hence, the title of the poem is highly wise, philosophical, and pregnant with meaning. The poet is perhaps not talking about physical wall. Maybe his intention is about creating a wall of love by picking up the boulders on each side. That is, rectifying the shortcomings on each side. He is against physical walls which makes the people inside the wall behave like ignorant Stone Age folk taking up weapons at the slightest cost. Hence, what we need is not physical walls, but a figurative wall of love. The poem has an autobiographical element too. A French Canadian named Napoleon Guy used to be Frost's neighbor in New Hampshire, and the two had often walked along their property line and repaired the wall that separated their lands. Ironically, the most famous line of the poem, "Good fences make good neighbors," was not a creation of Frost, but rather a phrase that Guy frequently declared to Frost during their walks. This particular adage was a popular colonial proverb in the middle of the 17th century. The poem presents two contrasting attitudes, one of the broad-mindedness and modernity represented by the speaker, and one of the conservative traditional ideology represented by the neighbor. However much the speaker tries to convince the neighbor that a wall is not needed after all, he refuses to oblige and clings to his steadfast belief that fences are essential to maintain good relationship between neighbors. According to the neighbor, a wall separating their properties eliminates potential conflicts between two landowners. He refuses to budge from the traditional belief instilled in him by his forefathers. Frost has been successful in bringing forth two contrasting attitudes. While the poet comes up with numerous arguments, the neighbor doesn't talk much but silences the poet with his short, no-nonsense answer. Good fences make good neighbors. He doesn't believe in talking much and hence would rather preoccupy himself with the act of mending the wall, which according to him is essential. The poem demonstrates the reality of life and scenario both at home and at world over. A fence eliminates any chance of someone trespassing into a zone which belongs to you. This is also true for relationships, neighboring countries, colleagues, or everything else in life. Some of the famous walls in the world include the Great Wall of China, Berlin Wall, walls separating Americans from Mexicans, or Israelis from Palestinians. Countries across the world are trying to make sure that there are robust boundaries so that others do not cross the borders. Classic example is that of India, which has tried to make good boundaries with its landlocked neighbors in order to avoid any kind of possible dispute. The Wagah border, Siachen Glacier, Arunachal Pradesh are some of the major border areas when we talk about India and its immediate neighbors, China and Pakistan. Now let's have a look at the poetic devices employed in the poem. The wall in the poem is a metaphor for two kinds of barriers, physical and mental. In another metaphor, boulders have been compared to bread loaves and balls. An instance of simile can be seen in the line, like an old Stone Age savage armed. Some unseen force of nature is personified in the line, something there is that doesn't love a wall. The wall is personified as a poet commands it to stay erect, as in the line, "Stay where you are until our backs are turned." An instance of parallelism can be seen in the line, "To each the boulders that have fallen to each." An example of pun can be seen, "And to whom I was like to give offense." Here the word offense is a pun as it reminds one of fence. Paradox is a figure of speech in which two opposite facts are juxtaposed together. The lines in the poem which oppose each other and brings in a clash of ideas are, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall. Good fences make good neighbors." The poem also has an allusion to elves, the tiny supernatural creatures drawn from folklore and myth. An instance of hyperbole can be seen when the poet says that his apple trees are not going to eat his neighbor's pine cones. Some examples of alliteration in the poem are: we wear our fingers rough. Before I built a wall. What I was walling in or walling out. Thank you.